The neon sign buzzed like an angry wasp, casting sickly pink light across the cracked parking lot. Moonlight Laundromat, it read, though half the letters flickered on and off like they were having seizures. I sat in my beat-up Honda, staring at the place that was about to become my new workplace, and honestly, every instinct I had was screaming at me to put the car in reverse and get the hell out of there. But rent was due in 3 days, and I had exactly $47 in my checking account. Student loans don't care if a place gives you the creeps. So I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath that tasted like dust and something metallic, and walked toward those glass doors that looked like they hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. The job posting had been weird from the start. Found it on some sketchy part of Craigslist that I'd never seen before, buried between ads for discreet massage therapy and someone selling a haunted mirror, serious inquiries only. Night shift attendant needed, it said. Wednesday through Saturday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. $45 an hour. $45 an hour to babysit washing machines? In a town where McDonald's paid minimum wage? That should have been red flag number 1, but when you're living off ramen noodles and your car's making sounds like a dying elephant, you don't ask too many questions about good fortune. The interview had been even weirder. Some guy named Curtis who looked like he hadn't slept in about 6 months called me back within an hour of applying. Didn't want references, didn't care about experience, just asked if I could follow simple instructions without asking questions. When I said yes, he gave me the address and told me to show up Wednesday at 10:45 p.m. sharp. Don't be early, he'd said, and there was something in his voice that made it sound less like advice and more like a threat. And don't be late either. Right at 10:45. Now here I was, checking my phone for the 5th time. 10:43 p.m. Close enough. The inside of the Moonlight Laundromat looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd only ever heard descriptions of laundromats from people who'd never actually seen one. Everything was too clean, too organized, too perfect. 20 washing machines lined the left wall, all identical, all gleaming white under the harsh fluorescent lights. 20 dryers faced them from the right side, humming softly even though they were empty. The floor was this weird checkerboard pattern of black and white tiles that hurt to look at directly, like it was moving when you weren't paying attention. Vending machines stood against the back wall, sodas, snacks, detergent, fabric softener, all fully stocked and glowing with that eerie inner light vending machines have. And in the center of it all sat this ancient folding table surrounded by mismatched plastic chairs, like someone had set up for a game of poker and then just left. You're 2 minutes early. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Curtis had appeared from somewhere. There was a door marked office that I hadn't noticed before, but I swear it hadn't been there when I walked in. He looked even worse than he had during our phone interview, if that was possible. Pale as notebook paper, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like they'd been drawn on with a Sharpie. His clothes hung off him like he'd lost about 30 pounds recently and hadn't bothered to buy smaller sizes. Sorry, It's fine. He waved a hand that was all bones and skin. Better early than late. Come on. He led me to a small counter near the front window, where an ancient cash register sat next to a clipboard and a metal folding chair that looked like it had been stolen from a church basement. Everything about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Too quiet, maybe? Too clean? Too empty? Simple job, Curtis said, pulling a piece of paper from under the register. People come in, they do their laundry, they leave. You just watch the place, make change when they need it, keep things clean. Easy money. He handed me the paper and I felt my stomach drop. It was a list of rules, typed on what looked like an actual typewriter. The paper was thick, yellowed around the edges, and it smelled like old books and something else I couldn't identify. Moonlight Laundromat, Night Shift Rules. 1. Never acknowledge a customer before they put money in a machine. Pretend they don't exist. 2. If someone asks what time it is, always say, almost closing time, regardless of the actual time. 3. Keep the center table clear. Never let anyone sit there. Never sit there yourself. 4. If all the machines stop running at once, count to 30 before checking on them. 5. The vending machines sometimes dispense items that aren't displayed. Take the money, give them what comes out, don't ask questions. 6. If you hear children laughing, turn on the radio immediately. Volume doesn't matter. 7. Never make direct eye contact with anyone who comes in wearing all white. 8. The phone will ring exactly 3 times every night. Don't answer it. I read through the list twice, then looked up at Curtis. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, like he was waiting for me to either run screaming or accept whatever insanity this was. These rules are pretty specific, I said. Is there some kind of reasoning behind them, or? His face went completely blank. You follow the rules, you keep the job. You don't follow the rules. He shrugged, like the rest of that sentence was too obvious to bother finishing. But what if I don't understand? You understand fine. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket and set them on the counter with a soft clink. Lock up at 7 a.m. sharp. I'll be back tomorrow night to check on things. And then he was gone. Not walking toward the door, not heading to his office. Just gone, like he'd evaporated into the stale laundromat air. I stood there for a minute, holding the rules and wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. My shift officially started in 13 minutes, and I was already getting paid to stand here and freak myself out. I folded the rules and stuck them in my pocket, then settled into the metal chair behind the counter. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, just something off about the air that I couldn't quite place. But as I sat there, it got stronger. Sweet but wrong. Like flowers that had been left in water too long, or fruit that was just starting to turn. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, and breathing through my mouth didn't help because I could taste it too. At exactly 11 p.m., the door chimed and my first customer walked in. She was maybe 60 years old, wearing a floral print dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. Normal enough except for the way she moved. Each step was perfectly measured, like she was following choreography only she could see. She carried a laundry basket filled with what looked like children's clothes, tiny t-shirts and little jeans and socks so small they might have fit a doll. I opened my mouth to say hello the way you do when you're working customer service, but rule 1 echoed in my head. Never acknowledge a customer before they put money in a machine. Pretend they don't exist. So I pretended she wasn't there. Kept my eyes on the magazine I'd found under the counter. Some ancient issue of People with a celebrity on the cover I didn't recognize. But I could hear her moving around, the soft whisper of her feet on the checkerboard floor, the gentle rustle of fabric. She went to the third washing machine from the left, and I heard the distinctive sound of quarters dropping into the slot. Clink, 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 clink. Then water started running and the machine began its familiar rumbling cycle. Only then did I look up and nod at her, the way you acknowledge any other customer. She nodded back, but something was off about her face. The features were all there: eyes, nose, mouth, but they seemed loose somehow, like they hadn't been properly attached and might slide around if she moved too quickly. She took a seat in one of the plastic chairs near her machine, pulled out some knitting and started working. Click, click, click went her needles, keeping perfect time with the washing machine's rhythm. Nothing weird about that, right? Just an old lady doing laundry and killing time. Except the clothes in her basket hadn't been children's clothes when she'd pulled them out to load the machine. They'd been adult-sized, dark colors, the kind of stuff you'd expect a 60-year-old woman to wear. But I'd definitely seen tiny shirts and little jeans when she'd walked in. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress, probably, or the weird lighting in this place playing tricks on my eyes. I went back to the magazine trying to focus on an article about some actor's divorce, but I kept glancing up at the woman. She'd stopped knitting and was just sitting there, staring at the center table with an expression of intense concentration. Her mouth was moving slightly, like she was having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. And her knitting needles, they were still clicking. Still keeping that perfect rhythm with the washing machine, even though her hands weren't moving anymore. At 11:23, a guy in his 20s came in carrying a garbage bag full of clothes. He looked normal enough: jeans, band t-shirt, sneakers that had seen better days. College kid, probably, judging by the way he looked around the place like he'd never done his own laundry before. He went straight to the change machine in the corner, fed it a $20 bill and started collecting quarters. That's when I noticed the old woman had stopped staring at the center table and was now watching him with the kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. The kid loaded his clothes into a machine, added detergent and started it up. Standard procedure. But when he turned around to find a seat, the old woman spoke for the first time since she'd arrived. "What time is it, honey?" The kid checked his phone. 11:25, he said. Rule 2 hit me like a slap in the face. If someone asks what time it is, always say, "Almost closing time," regardless of the actual time. "Actually," I called out quickly, "it's almost closing time." Both of them looked at me like I'd just spoken in tongues. The kid glanced at his phone again, confusion written all over his face. "But it's only almost closing time," I repeated firmly. The old woman's loose features rearranged themselves into what might have been a smile. "That's right," she said softly. "Almost closing time." The kid shrugged and found a chair, pulling out his phone to scroll through whatever college kids scroll through at 11:30 p.m. But I noticed he kept glancing at the clock on the wall, then at his phone like he was trying to figure out if one of them was broken. The next hour passed without incident, unless you counted the way the old woman's knitting needles never stopped clicking even when she wasn't knitting, or how the kid's reflection in the window seemed to be doing different things than he was actually doing. But hey, maybe my eyes were just tired. At 12:37 a.m., they both finished their loads and left within minutes of each other. The woman nodded at me on her way out, and for just a second, her face looked completely normal. Human. Then she was gone, and I was alone with the humming machines and that sweet, wrong smell that seemed to be getting stronger. I was starting to relax, thinking maybe this job wouldn't be so bad after all, when I heard it. Children laughing. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but it got louder and clearer by the second. High, bright laughter, the kind kids make when they're playing games that only make sense to them. But there were no children in the laundromat. Hell, there was nobody in the laundromat except me. Rule 6. If you hear children laughing, turn on the radio immediately. I looked around frantically for a radio and spotted one on the shelf behind the counter, an old boom box that looked like it belonged in the 1990s. I hit the power button and static filled the air, loud and harsh and beautiful because it drowned out that laughter completely. I didn't bother trying to find a station. The static was working just fine. The laughter stopped as soon as the radio came on, but I left it running anyway. Better safe than sorry, right? And honestly, the white noise was kind of comforting. Made the place feel less empty, less wrong. At 1:15 a.m., a woman walked in wearing a white sundress, white sandals, and a white headband that held back perfectly white hair. She looked like she was maybe 40, but her hair suggested either really bad genetics or something else entirely. Rule 7 screamed in my head. Never make direct eye contact with anyone who comes in wearing all white. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on my magazine while she loaded 2 machines with what sounded like a lot of clothes. Quarters clinked, water ran, machines started their cycles. Normal laundromat stuff except for how wrong everything felt. She sat down in a chair where I could see her in my peripheral vision, and that's when I realized why direct eye contact was forbidden. Her eyes weren't quite right. They reflected the fluorescent lights like an animal's eyes, and they never seemed to blink. She just sat there perfectly still, staring straight ahead at nothing. And she was humming. It was barely audible over the radio static in the washing machines, but it was there. A tune I almost recognized but couldn't quite place, something that made my teeth ache and my stomach clench. It went on, never changing, never getting louder or softer, just that same few notes repeated endlessly. I focused on my magazine so hard that I memorized an entire article about celebrity fashion disasters, but I could feel her presence like a cold spot in the room. The static from the radio started to develop patterns, almost like voices trying to break through, but I turned up the volume until it was loud enough to make my ears ring. She left at 2:43 a.m. without saying a word. Just collected her clothes, folded them with mechanical precision, and walked out. The second the door closed behind her, the radio static cleared up and started playing actual music. Some oldie station playing songs from the 1960s. I should have been relieved, but somehow the music was worse than the static. Every song felt wrong, like the words didn't quite match the melodies, or like they were being sung by people trying very hard to sound human. At exactly 3 a.m. the phone rang. Rule 8. The phone will ring exactly 3 times every night. Don't answer it. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times, then silence. But the silence felt heavier than the ringing had, like whatever was on the other end was still there, waiting, listening. The rest of the night crawled by like a wounded animal. A few more customers came and went, all normal enough if you didn't count the man whose shadow fell in the wrong direction, or the teenage girl who paid for her washing with quarters that were ice cold to the touch. I followed the rules, kept my head down, and tried not to think about what would happen if I screwed up. At 6:45 a.m., I was counting down the minutes until Curtis returned when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel, getting closer to the door. But when I looked up, nobody was there. The parking lot was empty except for my car, sitting under a streetlight that flickered like it was having electrical problems. The footsteps circled the building twice, then stopped right outside the front door. I could see the shadow of someone standing there, blocking some of the light from the street, but the glass door showed nothing but empty sidewalk. At exactly 7 a.m., Curtis walked in like he'd materialized out of thin air. Same hollow cheeks, same dark circles, same clothes hanging off his skeletal frame. He looked at me with those dead eyes and nodded once. Any problems? No problems, I said, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. Followed all the rules. Good. He moved to the register and started counting the night's take, his fingers moving through the bills with practiced efficiency. Same time tomorrow night. It wasn't a question. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, desperate to get out into the morning sunlight and remember what normal felt like. But as I reached for the handle, Curtis spoke again. "The rules exist for a reason," he said without looking up from the money. "People who don't follow them, well, let's just say this job has a high turnover rate." I didn't ask what he meant by that. I was pretty sure I didn't want to know. Outside, the morning air tasted like car exhaust and fast food, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, just breathing and trying to process what I just lived through. $45 an hour, I reminded myself. That was more than I'd ever made at any job, and all I had to do was babysit some washing machines and follow a few weird rules. How hard could it be? But as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of the Moonlight laundromat in my rearview mirror. The pink neon sign had switched off with the dawn, but something was still glowing in the windows. Not the fluorescent lights, those were off too. Something else, something that pulsed like a heartbeat and cast shadows that moved wrong. I forced myself to look away and focus on the road ahead. Whatever I'd signed up for, I was committed now. 3 more nights to get through, and then I'd have enough money to pay rent and maybe even buy groceries that didn't come from the dollar store. How bad could it possibly get? ## part 2. I spent the entire next day trying to convince myself that the first night had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Sleep deprivation, maybe, or just my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. The more daylight that passed, the more normal everything seemed. Just a weird old laundromat with an eccentric owner and some quirky rules. Nothing supernatural about it. That lasted until about 6 p.m., when I started getting ready for my second shift and found the rules sheet in my jacket pocket. The paper felt different. Thicker, somehow, and when I unfolded it, the typewritten text seemed darker, more pressed into the surface. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that there were now 9 rules instead of 8. Moonlight Laundromat, Night Shift Rules. 1. Never acknowledge a customer before they put money in a machine. Pretend they don't exist. 2. If someone asks what time it is, always say, "almost closing time," regardless of the actual time. 3. Keep the center table clear. Never let anyone sit there. Never sit there yourself. 4. If all the machines stop running at once, count to 30 before checking on them. 5. The vending machines sometimes dispense items that aren't displayed. Take the money, give them what comes out, don't ask questions. 6. If you hear children laughing, turn on the radio immediately. Volume doesn't matter. 7. Never make direct eye contact with anyone who comes in wearing all white. 8. The phone will ring exactly 3 times every night. Don't answer it. 9. If a customer tries to use the center table, offer them a seat elsewhere. If they insist, leave the building immediately and don't come back until sunrise. I read Rule 9 about 6 times, my hands shaking slightly. I definitely hadn't imagined the new edition. The typeface was identical to the rest, and it was pressed into the paper with the same force as the original 8 rules. But I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there yesterday, which meant either Curtis had somehow added it while I wasn't looking, or the rules were adding themselves. Neither option made me feel particularly good about going back. But $45 an hour is $45 an hour, and my landlord wasn't going to accept, but the job was creepy, as a substitute for rent money. So at 10:30 p.m. I was back in my car, staring at that buzzing pink neon sign and trying to work up the courage to go inside. The parking lot felt different tonight. More shadows, somehow, even though there were the same number of streetlights. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic that reminded me of mushrooms growing in dark places. Curtis was waiting inside when I arrived, but he looked worse than before. The dark circles under his eyes had spread, giving his face a bruised appearance, and his clothes hung even looser on his skeletal frame. He was counting money at the register with movements that seemed almost mechanical. "You're on time," he said without looking up. "Good." "The rules changed," I said, pulling the paper from my pocket. "There's a 9th one now." He glanced at the sheet, and for just a second, something that might have been fear flickered across his hollow features. Then it was gone, replaced by that same blank expression he'd worn yesterday. "Rules change when they need to change," he said. "Follow them exactly." "But why dash?" "Follow them exactly," he repeated, and there was something final in his voice that shut down any further questions. He finished counting the money, locked the register, and headed toward the office. Lock up at 7 a.m. sharp. And then he was gone again, leaving me alone with the humming machines and that growing smell of decay. I settled into the metal chair behind the counter and tried to focus on the magazine I'd brought, a recent issue of National Geographic that I'd grabbed from the campus bookstore. Reading about tropical rainforests and exotic animals seemed like a good way to keep my mind off whatever weirdness was about to unfold. The first customer arrived at 11:17 p.m. He was maybe 35, wearing a business suit that looked expensive but somehow wrong. The fabric seemed to shift and change in the fluorescent light, like it was made of something that wasn't quite material. He carried a briefcase instead of a laundry basket, which should have been my first clue that things were about to get weird. I kept my eyes on my magazine while he approached one of the washing machines. Rule 1 was already burned into my brain: never acknowledge a customer before they put money in a machine. But I could hear him moving around and the sounds were all wrong. His footsteps were too heavy, like he weighed twice what his appearance suggested, and they echoed strangely in the space. Then I heard the sound of quarters dropping into the machine. Clink, 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 clink. Water started running and the familiar rumbling began. That's when I looked up and nodded at him, the same polite acknowledgement I'd given every customer the night before. But when our eyes met, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. His eyes were completely black. Not dark brown, not dilated pupils, completely black, like someone had painted over them with tar. And they reflected the fluorescent lights like mirrors. He smiled, and his teeth were too white and too sharp, filed to points like a predator's. "What time is it?" he asked, and his voice had that same strange delay I'd noticed with some of the customers the night before. "Almost closing time," I said automatically, grateful that Rule 2 had become second nature. His smile widened, showing even more of those razor teeth. "Of course it is," he said. "It's always almost closing time here, isn't it?" I didn't answer that. It felt like a trap, like any response would be breaking some rule I didn't know about yet. Instead, I went back to my magazine and tried to pretend he wasn't there. But I could feel him watching me with those black mirror eyes. And after a few minutes, I heard him open his briefcase. I risked a glance up and immediately wished I hadn't. The briefcase was full of clothes, but they weren't human clothes. They looked like they'd been designed for something with too many arms, or arms that bent in the wrong places. Fabric twisted in geometries that hurt to look at directly. He loaded these impossible garments into the washing machine with careful precision, and I swear I saw some of them moving on their own, writhing like they were alive. The smell of mushrooms and decay got stronger, mixing with something that reminded me of wet concrete. When he finished loading the machine, he sat down in one of the plastic chairs and pulled a newspaper from his briefcase. A perfectly normal thing to do, except the newspaper was upside down and he was reading it like that was completely natural. At 11:45, a family walked in: mother, father, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. They looked normal enough at first glance, but something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. They stayed perfectly in formation, the parents flanking the child, and they all blinked at exactly the same time. The mother was wearing all white. Rule 7 screamed in my head, and I immediately looked down at my magazine. No direct eye contact with anyone wearing all white, but I could hear them moving around the laundromat and the sounds were all wrong. Their footsteps were perfectly synchronized, like they were one organism pretending to be three. "What time is it?" the father asked. "Almost closing time," I replied without looking up. "Thank you," all three of them said in unison, their voices blending into harmony that made my teeth ache. They loaded 2 machines with what sounded like a lot of clothes, though I couldn't imagine how 3 people could have that much laundry. The quarters clinked, water ran, machines started their cycles. Normal laundromat sounds that somehow felt completely wrong. I kept my eyes glued to an article about Madagascar lemurs, but I could sense them sitting in the plastic chairs, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. Even the little girl, who should have been fidgeting or asking questions or doing any of the things kids do when they're bored. That's when I realized I couldn't hear the business suit guy's washing machine anymore. I glanced up carefully, avoiding looking directly at the white-wearing family, and saw that his machine had stopped mid-cycle. The water was still, the drum motionless, like someone had just flipped a switch. But the timer still showed 23 minutes remaining. Then I noticed that all the other machines had stopped too. Every single one, even the ones that weren't being used. The laundromat had gone completely quiet except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the vending machines. Rule 4 kicked in. If all the machines stop running at once, count to 30 before checking on them. I started counting in my head, trying to keep my breathing steady and my eyes on my magazine. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. But at 15 Mississippi, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Children laughing. Not just one child, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. High, bright laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling and floor until it was all I could hear. The sound built and built, getting louder and more hysterical with each passing second. Rule 6. If you hear children laughing, turn on the radio immediately. I lunged for the boom box, nearly knocking over my chair in the process. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely find the power button, but when I finally got it on, the static filled the air and the laughter stopped like someone had cut it with a knife. But the silence that followed was worse than the laughter had been. I looked around the laundromat, and that's when I noticed that the family was gone. Not walking toward the door, not collecting their clothes, just gone like they'd never been there at all. The only sign they'd existed was that 2 of the washing machines were running again, spinning wet clothes that I couldn't quite focus on directly. The business suit guy was still there, still reading his upside-down newspaper. But now he was grinning, those pointed teeth catching the fluorescent light, and I realized he'd been watching me the entire time. "Interesting night," he said conversationally, as if nothing weird had just happened. I didn't respond. Something told me that engaging with him would be a very bad idea. 28 Mississippi, 29 Mississippi, 30 Mississippi. I got up from my chair and walked over to the nearest silent machine. The moment I touched the control panel, it roared back to life, water sloshing and drums spinning like nothing had ever been wrong. One by one, the other machines followed suit, filling the space with familiar mechanical sounds. Crisis averted, apparently. But when I turned around, the business suit guy was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard him move, hadn't seen him get up from his chair. He was just there, close enough that I could smell something coming off him that reminded me of copper pennies and rotting flowers. "You're learning," he said, and his voice was different now. Layered, like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. "That's good. The rules exist for a reason." I backed away slowly, trying to get some distance between us, but he matched my movements step for step. Those black mirror eyes never left my face. "Some of us have been waiting a long time for someone who could follow the rules properly," he continued. "The last attendant, well, let's just say he had trouble with instruction. I'm just here to do my job," I managed to say. His smile widened impossibly, stretching beyond the boundaries of human anatomy. "Of course you are. And you're doing it so well." That's when his washing machine chimed, indicating the cycle was complete. He turned away from me with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk, collected his impossible clothes from the machine, and packed them back into his briefcase. The fabric writhed and twisted as he folded it, and I swear I saw something that might have been an eye blink at me from between the folds. "See you tomorrow night," he said as he headed for the door. "Same time, same place." After he left, I stood there for a full 5 minutes trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, and that smell of copper and rotting flowers lingered in the air like a promise. The rest of the night passed in a haze of increasingly bizarre customers. A woman who paid for her washing with coins that were still warm, like they'd just been minted. A teenager whose reflection in the window showed him as an old man. A couple who spoke to each other in a language that sounded like it was being played backward. At exactly 3 a.m. the phone rang 3 times. I let it go to silence, just like Rule 8 demanded, but the silence felt heavier tonight. More watchful. Around 4:30 a.m., a man in overalls came in carrying what looked like a normal laundry basket. But when he started loading one of the machines, I realized the clothes he was washing were covered in dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Fresh blood, still wet and gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He caught me staring and winked. One of his eyes was missing, just an empty socket that seemed to go deeper than anatomy should have allowed. I went back to my magazine and tried very hard not to think about what those stains might be or where they'd come from. The sun was starting to creep over the horizon when Curtis finally returned, looking even more skeletal than before. His clothes were hanging off him like he was a scarecrow, and when he moved, I could hear his joints creaking. "Any problems?" he asked, starting his count of the night's take. "No problems," I lied. "Followed all the rules." He looked up at me with those hollow eyes, and for a second I thought I saw something that might have been relief flicker across his face. "Good," he said. "The rules are important. More important than you know." "Curtis," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. "What is this place really? What are we doing here?" He finished counting the money before answering, his skeletal fingers moving through the bills with practiced efficiency. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We're maintaining the balance," he said. "This place, it's a boundary, a neutral zone where certain things can exist safely. The rules keep everyone in line, keep the agreement intact." "What agreement?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see something like pity in his hollow features. "The one that keeps them on this side instead of spreading out into the world," he said. "The one that keeps normal people safe from things they're not ready to understand." I wanted to ask more questions, but he was already heading toward the office, his movements stiff and mechanical. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. "You're doing good work," he said. "Better than most." Just keep following the rules. No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear or think you understand, just follow the rules. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the growing realization that I'd stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple night job. Outside, the morning sun was painting the parking lot in shades of gold and amber, but I could still smell that mushroom decay in the air. Still feel the weight of Black Mirror eyes watching me from the shadows. 2 nights down, 2 to go. And I was starting to suspect that the worst was yet to come. I didn't sleep Wednesday. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those Black Mirror eyes and that impossibly wide grin full of razor teeth. I kept hearing that layered voice saying, "You're learning," over and over until I wanted to scream. By 3 p.m., I'd consumed enough coffee to kill a horse and was seriously considering just not showing up for my 3rd shift. $45 an hour wasn't worth my sanity, and I was starting to think it definitely wasn't worth my life. But then my phone rang. "This is Curtis." His voice sounded even more hollow over the phone, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "You're planning to come in tonight." It wasn't a question. And somehow the way he said it made it clear that not showing up wasn't really an option. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Same time as always." "Good. Things might be different tonight. More active. Just stick to the rules no matter what happens." "What do you mean, more active?" But he'd already hung up. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching everything I could find about the Moonlight Laundromat online. What I found wasn't reassuring. The place had been built in 1987 on the site of an old cemetery that had been relocated to make room for commercial development. Relocated was in quotes in every article I found, like the reporters weren't entirely convinced that's what had actually happened. There'd been 17 different night attendants over the past 5 years. Some had quit after 1 shift. Others had lasted a few weeks before disappearing entirely. One guy named Marcus had made it 3 months before he was found wandering the desert 20 miles away, completely naked and speaking in a language nobody recognized. He was in a psychiatric facility now, according to one article, still speaking that impossible language. The only constant was Curtis, who'd been the day manager for 6 years and apparently never took time off, never got sick, and according to one former employee, never seemed to age. All of this should have convinced me to stay far away from the Moonlight Laundromat. Instead, it just made me more curious about what I'd stumbled into. At 10:30 p.m., I was back in my car, staring at that pink neon sign and trying to work up the courage to go inside. The parking lot felt different again, not just more shadows this time, but like the shadows were moving independently of their sources. The air smelled like ozone and burnt copper, and there was an electric feeling that made my hair stand on end. When I walked through those glass doors, I immediately knew something was very wrong. The laundromat looked the same: 20 washing machines, 20 dryers, that weird checkerboard floor, the vending machines glowing against the back wall. But it felt bigger somehow, like the walls had moved outward when I wasn't looking. The fluorescent lights were dimmer than usual, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows seem deeper and more substantial. And the center table, the one Rule 3 said to keep clear, wasn't empty anymore. A chess set sat in the middle of it. Not just any chess set, but an ornate one with pieces carved from what looked like bone and obsidian. The white pieces seemed to glow with their own light, while the black pieces absorbed light like tiny holes in reality. Curtis was nowhere to be seen. No note on the counter, no sign he'd ever been there at all. Just me and that chess set and the growing certainty that tonight was going to be very different from the first 2 shifts. I checked the rules sheet in my pocket and sure enough there was a 10th rule now. 10. If someone wants to play a game at the center table, you must accept. If you lose, leave immediately and never return. If you win, the real work begins. My hands were shaking as I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. The real work begins. What the hell did that mean? What had I been doing for the past 2 nights if not the real work? I clocked in at exactly 11 p.m., and the mechanical thunk echoed strangely in the expanded space. The register came alive, but instead of displaying a dollar amount, the screen just showed a series of symbols that hurt to look at directly. That's when I heard footsteps outside. Not the normal footsteps of customers approaching. These were heavy, deliberate, like someone wearing boots made of stone. They circled the building once, twice, 3 times before stopping right outside the front door. The glass doors slid open with their usual wheeze, but nobody walked through. The entrance stood open, letting in air that smelled like grave dirt and old roses, while those heavy footsteps continued into the laundromat. I could see the impressions they left in the checkerboard floor, deep dents in the tiles that cracked outward like something impossibly heavy was making them. But there was nothing visible causing them. Just footsteps walking through empty air toward the center table. When they reached the chess set, they stopped. One of the chairs scraped against the floor as it was pulled out, and I watched the seat compress under the weight of something I couldn't see. Then a voice spoke. It was the same layered voice I'd heard from the business suit guy the night before, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your move," it said. I looked around the empty laundromat, hoping to see another customer who might be the target of that invitation. But I was alone with the invisible presence and that bone and obsidian chess set. "Your move," the voice repeated, and this time there was no mistaking that it was talking to me. Rule 10 burned in my mind. If someone wants to play a game at the center table, you must accept. I walked over on unsteady legs and sat down across from the empty chair. Up close, the chess pieces were even more disturbing. The white pieces were carved from what looked like human teeth and finger bones, while the black pieces seemed to be made of compressed shadow that moved independently of the light. "You're new," the invisible presence said, and I felt the chair across from me shift as whatever was sitting in it leaned forward. "The others didn't last this long." "What others?" I managed to ask. "The 17 who came before you. Most quit after seeing us. A few tried to break the rules. One even tried to destroy the chess set." There was something that might have been laughter in that layered voice. That didn't end well for him. Marcus, I realized. The guy who'd been found in the desert speaking an impossible language. "What happens if I win?" I asked. "Then you understand what this place really is. What you're really protecting. And you decide whether to stay or join the 17 who came before. And if I lose? Then you leave and never come back, and we find someone else to maintain the balance." I reached for one of the white pawns, and the moment my fingers touched the bone surface, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded my mind, flashes of things that shouldn't exist, places that couldn't be real, creatures that violated every law of physics and biology. I saw the laundromat as it really was, not a business but a nexus point where multiple realities intersected. A place where things from other dimensions could safely cross over without contaminating our world entirely. The customers I'd been serving weren't customers at all. They were refugees, explorers, entities that needed to interact with human commerce but couldn't risk full exposure to our reality. The rules weren't arbitrary, they were a carefully negotiated treaty that allowed both sides to coexist without destroying each other. And the night attendant wasn't just an employee. They were a guardian, a gatekeeper who maintained the delicate balance that kept horrors beyond imagination from spilling into our world. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, I understood everything. The strange customers, the impossible physics, the way Curtis looked more skeletal each day, it was all part of the same system. A system that was slowly consuming everyone who participated in it. "Now you see," the invisible presence said as I moved my pawn forward 2 spaces. "Now you understand the choice." The game that followed was unlike any chess I'd ever played. The pieces moved according to rules I didn't recognize, and sometimes they moved on their own, repositioning themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. My opponent was clearly experienced. Every move was calculated, precise, designed to corner me into impossible positions. But I'd been playing chess since I was 8 years old, and despite the supernatural circumstances, the basic strategy still applied. I focused on controlling the center, protecting my king, looking for patterns in my opponent's play. Around midnight, other customers started arriving. But these weren't the relatively normal entities I'd dealt with before. These were things that had given up any pretense of humanity. A mass of writhing tentacles oozed through the door and began operating 3 washing machines simultaneously. Something that looked like a tornado made of screaming faces spun around the room before settling into a dryer. A creature that might have been a spider the size of a small car skittered across the ceiling, leaving sticky tracks that glowed with phosphorescent light. Through it all, I kept playing chess and following the rules. When the tentacle mass asked what time it was, I said, "Almost closing time," without looking up from the board. When all the machines stopped at once, I counted to 30 before checking on them, even though it meant losing my rook to a particularly aggressive move from my invisible opponent. At 1:30 a.m. I realized I was winning. My opponent had been sacrificing pieces to maintain pressure, but I'd managed to build a solid defensive position while slowly advancing my remaining pieces. I was up a bishop and 2 pawns, and my king was safe behind a wall of carefully positioned defenders. "Interesting," the layered voice said as I captured another of its pieces. "It's been a long time since someone put up this much of a fight." "How long?" I asked, moving my queen into an attacking position. "The last attendant who won this game was in 1987, the original night manager. He lasted 15 years before the work finally consumed him entirely." I looked up at the mention of 1987, The same year the laundromat had been built on the relocated cemetery. What happened to him? He became me, the voice said simply. Just as whoever wins tonight will eventually become the next guardian when I finally fade away. That's when I understood what Curtis had meant about the real work. The night attendant wasn't just maintaining the balance, they were slowly becoming part of it, transforming into something that could exist between dimensions. Curtis wasn't just looking skeletal because he was tired. He was literally fading away, becoming more spirit than human with each passing day. And if I won this game, I'd be signing up for the same fate. But if I lost, something else would take over the laundromat. Something that might not be as committed to maintaining the balance. Something that might let the horrors spill over into our world without restriction. At 2:45 a.m., I put the invisible presence in checkmate. The chess pieces immediately began to dissolve, crumbling into dust that sparkled briefly before disappearing entirely. The chair across from me scraped against the floor as my opponent stood up, and I felt a presence looming over me. "Well played," the layered voice said, and now it sounded different. Sad maybe, or relieved. "You understand the choice now. Stay and slowly become what I am, or leave and let whatever comes next take responsibility for this place." I looked around the laundromat at the impossible customers going about their impossible business. The tentacle mass was folding clothes with surprising delicacy. The screaming tornado had somehow gotten its laundry perfectly dry. The giant spider was methodically cleaning its webs off the ceiling. They weren't monsters, I realized. They were just different. Alien, maybe, or from dimensions where different rules applied. But they were trying to coexist, trying to find a way to interact with our reality without destroying it. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. "Until sunrise," the voice said. "Choose wisely. The balance depends on it." The rest of the night passed in a strange kind of peace. The impossible customers finished their laundry and left through dimensions I couldn't see. The machines ran their cycles with mechanical precision. The phone rang 3 times at 3 a.m. and I let it go to silence like always. But everything felt different now that I understood what was really happening. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling. A responsibility that came with terrible costs but served a purpose larger than anything I'd ever been part of. When Curtis appeared at 6:45 a.m., he looked more translucent than before, like he was slowly becoming a ghost. But his hollow eyes held something that might have been hope. "You won," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yeah," I said. "I won." "Then you understand what comes next." I looked out the window at the sunrise painting the parking lot in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, I'd have to make a choice that would determine not just my fate, but the fate of everyone who lived in blissful ignorance of the things that moved in the spaces between realities. "I understand," I said. "But I need time to think about it." Curtis nodded slowly. "You have until tomorrow night. After that, the balance tips too far in one direction or the other." He started his count of the night's take, but the register was full of those impossible symbols instead of money. Numbers that existed in mathematical systems our reality wasn't equipped to handle. "Curtis," I said as he finished, "what's your real name?" He looked up at me with eyes that were already more shadow than substance. "I don't remember anymore," he said. "It's been so long since I was human enough to need one." Then he was gone, fading away like smoke until I was alone with my thoughts and the weight of an impossible decision. Outside, the morning sun was burning away the shadows, but I knew they'd be back. They always came back when the light faded and the balance needed maintaining. I had one more shift to get through, and then I'd have to decide whether to become a guardian of horrors or let someone else take responsibility for keeping the worlds from colliding. Either way, I was pretty sure I'd never be the same person who'd answered that Craigslist ad looking for easy money. Some choices change you just by being offered, whether you accept them or not. ## Part 4 Final. I didn't go home Thursday morning. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour diner about 10 miles from the laundromat and sat in a corner booth, drinking coffee and staring out the window at normal people living their normal lives. People who had no idea that reality was held together by invisible guardians slowly sacrificing their humanity to keep nightmare dimensions from bleeding into our world. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores according to her name tag, kept refilling my cup and giving me concerned looks. I probably looked like hell. I felt like hell. How do you process the information that you've been chosen to become something that exists between human and inhuman, slowly fading away over years or decades until you're nothing but a voice speaking from an invisible body? Around noon, I called my sister Sarah back in Ohio. We'd been close growing up, and if anyone could help me think through an impossible decision, it would be her. "You sound awful," she said after I'd managed to get through the usual small talk. Are you sleeping? Eating? It's this new job, I said, which was both completely true and completely inadequate. It's complicated. What kind of job keeps you up for days? Are you dealing drugs or something? I almost laughed at that. Dealing drugs would have been so much simpler. No, nothing like that. It's just, Sarah, have you ever had to make a choice where both options would change your life completely, and you couldn't tell which one was right? There was a long pause. Are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you need money or... Not that kind of trouble. Just, hypothetically, if you had to choose between taking on a huge responsibility that would slowly destroy who you are, or walking away and letting something potentially catastrophic happen to other people, what would you do? Another pause, longer this time. That's a hell of a hypothetical question. Are we talking about the military? Some kind of government job? Something like that? Well, she said slowly, I've always admired people who put others before themselves. But not if it means throwing your life away for nothing. The key word there is potentially catastrophic. How sure are you that walking away would actually hurt anyone? That was the question, wasn't it? How sure was I that the laundromat actually served a purpose? That the interdimensional refugees I'd been serving were better contained than scattered? That the balance Curtis kept talking about was real and not just the delusion of someone who'd been driven insane by an impossible job? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe 50-50. Then you walk away, she said firmly. You can't sacrifice yourself for a maybe. If it was a certainty, that would be different. But 50-50 odds? That's not enough. We talked for another hour about safer topics. Her job at the hospital, her boyfriend who was thinking about proposing, mom and dad's plan to retire to Florida. Normal life stuff that felt surreal after 3 nights of serving customers who violated the laws of physics. When I finally hung up, I felt more confused than before. Sarah was right about the uncertainty, but she'd never seen what I'd seen. She didn't know about the tentacle creature that folded clothes with impossible gentleness, or the screaming tornado that just wanted its laundry done properly. Were they refugees seeking sanctuary, or invaders testing our defenses? I spent the afternoon at the public library, researching everything I could find about dimensional theory, parallel universes, and intersections between realities. Most of it was either pure science fiction or theoretical physics so complex that it might as well have been written in an alien language. But I did find one thing that made me think. An article by a physicist named Dr. Elena Vasquez about boundary phenomena, places where the normal rules of reality seem temporarily suspended. She documented dozens of locations around the world where strange things happened with suspicious regularity. Places that locals avoided without being able to explain why. According to her research, these boundary phenomena weren't random. They followed patterns, showed up in clusters, and seemed to be connected to specific geological or historical factors. Old burial grounds, sites of massive trauma, places where the boundary between dimensions had been weakened somehow. The Moonlight Laundromat fit the pattern perfectly. Built on a relocated cemetery, staffed by people who slowly lost their humanity, serving customers that couldn't possibly exist in our reality. But Dr. Vasquez's article raised more questions than it answered. Were these places natural phenomena that humanity had learned to manage, or artificial constructs created to contain something worse? Were the Guardians heroes keeping us safe, or prisoners maintaining their own cages? At 9 p.m. I was back in my car, staring at that pink neon sign and trying to work up the courage to face my final shift. Win or lose, this would be the last night I could pretend to be normal. Either I'd accept the responsibility and begin my slow transformation into something inhuman, or I'd walk away and spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd doomed humanity through cowardice. The parking lot felt different tonight. Heavier somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. The shadows moved with purpose, reaching toward the laundromat like fingers stretching toward warmth. The smell of ozone and decay was stronger than ever, mixed with something that reminded me of hospitals and funeral homes. When I walked through those glass doors, I immediately knew this wasn't going to be like the other nights. The laundromat had transformed completely. The walls stretched away into impossible distances, creating a space that could have held a football stadium. The 20 washing machines had multiplied into hundreds, arranged in perfect rows that extended beyond the range of the fluorescent lights. The checkerboard floor had become a complex mandala pattern that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. And the center table was occupied. Curtis sat there, but it was Curtis as he'd never been during our previous encounters. He looked solid, human, healthy, like someone had restored him to what he'd been before taking this job. His hollow cheeks were full, his dark circles had disappeared, and his clothes actually fit his frame properly. Across from him sat someone I didn't recognize. A woman in her 30s with short black hair and intelligent eyes, wearing the same type of clothes Curtis usually wore, practical, nondescript, the uniform of someone whose job required them to be invisible. "You're early," Curtis said, and his voice had substance again instead of that hollow echo I'd grown accustomed to. "But that's fine. We have a lot to discuss." I approached the table cautiously, noting that both of them looked more real, more present than anything else in the transformed space. The woman gestured to an empty chair, and I sat down with the feeling that I was joining a council whose decisions shaped reality itself. "This is Elena," Curtis said. "My replacement if you decide to walk away." I looked at the woman more carefully and felt a chill of recognition. Dr. Elena Vasquez? The physicist who wrote about boundary phenomena? She smiled, but it was a sad expression. "That's my day job. Has been for 6 years, ever since I started researching these places. When you study the abyss long enough, eventually it starts studying you back." "You're here to take over if I leave?" "I'm here because I understand what this place is and why it matters," she said. "I've been preparing for this responsibility for years, learning everything I could about dimensional intersections and reality maintenance. If you choose to walk away, I'll step in." Curtis leaned forward, and I could see echoes of the skeletal figure he'd become during his years of service. "But that's not the choice I'm hoping you'll make." "Why?" I asked. "Why do you care whether it's me or her?" "Because you've already proven you can handle the work," he said. "You followed the rules instinctively, adapted to impossible situations, maintained the balance even when you didn't understand what you were protecting. Elena is brilliant, dedicated, prepared, but she's never actually done the job. You have." I looked around the impossible space, at the hundreds of washing machines humming in perfect synchronization, at the mandala floor that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "What happens to you if I accept?" "I finally get to rest," Curtis said simply. "I've been holding this position for 6 years, slowly losing pieces of myself to keep the boundary stable. If you take over, I can let go. And if I don't? Then Elena takes the job, and I continue fading until there's nothing left of me but the voice you heard playing chess last night. Eventually, I'll become completely incorporeal, just another guardian spirit bound to this place." Elena spoke up. "There's something else you should know. The boundary is weakening. All of them are worldwide. Dr. Vasquez's research isn't just academic, it's a warning. These places need stronger guardians than they've had before, people who can adapt to changing conditions." "Changing how?" Curtis answered. "The entities coming through are getting more powerful, more desperate. Their home dimensions are collapsing, dying, and they need somewhere to go. We're not just maintaining a laundromat anymore, we're running a refugee camp for beings that exist outside normal physics. And if the boundary fails completely? Then they spill over into our reality without any constraints," Elena said grimly. "Imagine what you've seen here but spread across the entire world. Entities that exist in dimensions with different rules trying to survive in ours, changing everything they touch." I thought about the tentacle creature folding clothes, the screaming tornado that just wanted its laundry done. They'd seem strange but not malicious. But what would happen if they didn't have rules to follow, boundaries to respect? "How long do I have?" I asked. Curtis and Elena exchanged glances. "The transition needs to happen tonight," Curtis said. "I can't hold the boundary much longer. Another day or two, and I'll fade completely whether there's a replacement or not." I looked around the transformed laundromat, at the impossible architecture that existed because someone had been willing to sacrifice their humanity to maintain it. In a few hours, I'd either become part of this system or abandon it to someone else. "Can I see what I'd become?" I asked. "The full truth about what accepting this job means?" Curtis nodded and reached across the table to touch my hand. The world exploded into sensation again, but this time I was ready for it. I saw the laundromat as it really was, not a building but a carefully constructed intersection between realities, held stable by conscious will and constant attention. I saw the customers not as monsters but as refugees from dying worlds, seeking safe passage through our dimension. And I saw the guardians, dozens of them throughout history, each one slowly sacrificing their humanity to maintain the balance. Some lasted years, others decades, but all of them eventually faded into something that was no longer quite human. But I also saw what happened when the guardians failed. Realities bleeding into each other, natural laws breaking down, entire cities consumed by physics that didn't belong in our world. The guardians weren't just maintaining laundromats and gas stations and grocery stores, they were holding back chaos itself. When the vision ended, I understood everything. The weight of the responsibility, the cost of acceptance, the consequences of walking away. I also understood something else. The choice wasn't really between sacrificing myself and staying safe. It was between accepting responsibility for something larger than myself, or passing that responsibility to someone else who'd make the same sacrifice. Either way, someone was going to slowly lose their humanity to keep the world stable. The only question was whether it would be me or Elena. "I'll do it," I said. Curtis smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. "Thank you." Elena looked relieved but also disappointed. "Are you sure? Because once you accept, there's no going back." "I'm sure. But I want to understand what I'm agreeing to. All of it." For the next 2 hours, Curtis and Elena explained everything. The network of boundary guardians worldwide, the communication systems that link them, the protocols for handling different types of dimensional refugees. The gradual transformation process that would slowly change my body and mind to exist partially outside normal reality. It wasn't just about following rules anymore. As the guardian, I'd be responsible for creating and updating those rules as conditions changed. I'd need to negotiate with entities from other dimensions, establish safe passage protocols, and maintain the delicate balance that kept multiple realities from destroying each other. And yes, I'd slowly become less human in the process, but I'd also become part of something larger, more important than any individual life. At exactly 11 p.m., the first customers of my new tenure began arriving. But now I could see them clearly, not as monsters pretending to be human, but as desperate travelers from places where the fundamental rules of existence were different. The business suit entity from my second night appeared first, still wearing those impossible clothes that moved independently of his body. But now I understood that he was a scout, checking to make sure the boundary was still stable and properly maintained. "New management?" he asked, those black mirror eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights. "New management," I confirmed. "Same rules, same respect for the boundary." He nodded and moved toward one of the washing machines. But before he started his cycle, he turned back to me. "For what it's worth," he said in that layered voice, "you're making the right choice. We're not invaders. We're survivors. And this place, it's hope for both our kinds." More customers followed throughout the night. The family in white who moved in perfect synchronization. The tentacle creature that folded clothes with impossible delicacy. The screaming tornado that just wanted to dry its mysterious belongings in peace. Each one nodded to me with something that looked like respect or maybe gratitude. They understood what I'd chosen to become, what I'd sacrificed to keep their refuge safe. At 3 a.m. the phone rang 3 times. But this time I answered it. "Boundary Station 7, I said, using the terminology Curtis had taught me. "Status report," said a voice that sounded human but carried harmonics that suggested otherwise. "Transition complete. New guardian in place. Boundary stable. Acknowledged. Welcome to the network." The line went dead, but I felt something I hadn't expected. Connection. I was part of something now, part of a system that spanned the globe and protected billions of people who would never know it existed. When dawn broke over the parking lot, Curtis was already fading. The borrowed solidity he'd shown during our long conversation was disappearing, revealing the skeletal figure he'd become over years of service. "Any regrets?" he asked. I looked around the laundromat, my laundromat now, at the dimensional refugees finishing their cycles and preparing to return to whatever realities they called home. "Ask me again in 6 years," I said. Curtis laughed, and for a moment he sounded completely human again. Then he was gone, not fading gradually but simply absent, like he'd never been there at all. Elena appeared at 7 a.m. to officially transfer the position. She handed me a set of keys that felt heavier than they should, and a handbook that was written in multiple languages, including some that didn't use any alphabet I recognized. "The learning curve is steep," she said, "but you'll adapt. They always do. What about you? Are you disappointed you didn't get the job?" She shrugged. "I'll find another station that needs a guardian. There are always openings and not enough people willing to fill them." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet laundromat, watching the morning sun paint the parking lot in shades of gold and amber. The pink neon sign had shut off with the dawn, but I could feel its presence like a heartbeat, calling to travelers who needed safe passage between worlds. I thought about my sister Sarah, about my old life and the choices that had led me here. In a few hours, I'd need to call her and explain that I wouldn't be coming home for Christmas, that I'd taken a job that required total commitment but couldn't explain what it actually involved. She'd worry, of course. They always did, the families of people who became guardians. But they adapted too, eventually. They had to. I pulled out my phone and started typing a text message. Got the promotion. Long-term position with excellent benefits. Can't really explain the details, but I'm exactly where I need to be. Love you. Then I put the phone away and started preparing for my first full day as guardian of Boundary Station 7. There were protocols to memorize, entity classifications to study, and dimensional physics to understand. But first I had to update the rules. Conditions were changing, and the next night attendant, if there ever was one, would need clearer guidance than I'd had. I found a typewriter in the office, the same one that had been used to create the original rules, and fed in a fresh sheet of that thick, parchment-like paper. Moonlight Laundromat Guardian Protocols. 1. Remember that every customer is someone's family, regardless of how they look or what dimension they come from. 2. The balance isn't just about following rules, it's about making choices that protect everyone. 3. You're not losing your humanity by doing this job. You're expanding it to include realities most people can't imagine. 4. When in doubt, choose compassion over fear. 5. The work changes you, but change isn't always loss. I stopped there. The rest would depend on whoever came after me, what challenges they'd face, what choices they'd need to make. Outside, the world was waking up to another normal day, full of people who had no idea how strange and wonderful and terrifying reality actually was. And that was fine. They didn't need to know. But they needed someone to stand guard at the places where impossibility leaked through. Someone willing to sacrifice their ordinary human life to maintain the extraordinary balance that kept all life, human and inhuman, from destroying itself. I'd chosen to be that someone. And despite everything I'd lose in the years to come, I was pretty sure it was the right choice. The pink neon sign would buzz back to life when darkness fell, calling to travelers from dimensions I was only beginning to understand. And I'd be here to welcome them, to maintain the rules that kept everyone safe, and to slowly become something that existed between worlds. It was going to be the most important job I'd ever have. Even if no one would ever know I was doing it,